Forget what John Wayne showed you about stagecoaches. That smooth ride with pretty young ladies and a beautiful sunset. Hollywood nonsense. The real thing was brutal. Men crammed together for days, bones rattled on dirt roads, robberies almost every week, and accidents that killed entire families. Diaries from that time tell what no movie ever had the guts to show. Come with me through these 20 facts. Number 1. The human sardine can. 9 passengers, where 6 could fit. Have you ever been stuck in traffic inside a packed pickup truck with people you've never seen in your life? Now imagine that lasting for days straight, with no air conditioning, no bathroom stop, crossing the desert under a sun that could melt even a saint's patience. The stagecoaches that crossed the American West between the 1850s and 1880s were one of the country's first mass transportation systems. Companies like the Overland Mail Company in Butterfield ran routes connecting towns separated by hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The problem is, those companies worked like any business that puts profit above common sense. The cabin of a standard Concord-style stagecoach was designed to hold 6 seated passengers. But the companies sold 9 tickets per trip. 9 adults squeezed into a space that barely fit 6, knees knocking against each other with no room to stretch their legs, breathing the same stale air for days. And the bathroom situation is where things got really rough. There was no scheduled stop for basic needs. When someone couldn't hold it anymore, the solution was a bucket in the middle of the cabin, in front of everyone, men, women, children, all right there witnessing the moment. After 2 or 3 days crossing dry, dusty terrain, the smell inside that wooden box became something that would stick in your memory forever. Civil War veterans, men who had lived through battlefields full of bodies, reported that the stench of an overcrowded stagecoach could give even someone who had seen the worst of humanity a run for their money. What stands out is that this logic of cramming people in to maximize revenue isn't something that stayed in the 19th century. When you get on a plane today and realize the space between the seats has shrunk again, you're living through the same business philosophy those stagecoach companies were using 150 years ago. The technology changed, but the greed for that extra penny per passenger stayed exactly the same. Number 2. The dust that destroyed lungs forever. Here's something most people never stop to think about. When we see scenes of the Old West in movies, the stagecoach shows up rolling beautifully down the road. What nobody shows is what happened inside that closed cabin with 6 or 8 people crammed together while the wheels slammed against the dry ground for hours on end. The roads had no pavement at all. It was pure dirt, dry, baked by the sun. When the horses took off and the wheels started turning, a thick cloud of dust rose from the ground and got in through every crack in the cabin. And we're not talking about a little bit of powder. Reports from the time describe passengers who, after 2 or 3 hours of travel, couldn't even see the person sitting in front of them. The dust covered everything: clothes, skin, hair. But the real problem was what it did on the inside. That heavy dust built up in the eyes, the throat, and especially the lungs. Doctors who treated people in towns along the routes documented cases of chronic coughing that lasted for months after a single long trip. Some travelers never fully recovered and developed breathing problems for the rest of their lives. In 1850s California, when the gold rush drew thousands of people west, these conditions were everyday life for anyone who needed to travel between towns. The only protection there was tying a wet bandana around your face. It worked for a few minutes until the water dried and the cloth got caked with dirt. After that, you were just breathing dust straight in. And here's the detail: that puts everything into perspective. Long-term exposure to dust as a cause of chronic lung disease was only officially recognized and regulated in the United States in the 20th century, when workplace safety laws began protecting factory and mine workers. In other words, those stagecoach passengers were facing the equivalent of heavy industrial exposure with absolutely no protection, and without anyone at the time understanding the long-term damage it caused. Number 3. Why robbing stagecoaches was the best business in the West. Picture the scene: a Wells Fargo stagecoach crossing the desert carrying gold. The driver had no gun, the road had no witnesses, and the man who understood that equation better than anyone was named Charles Bowles, known as Black Bart. Between 1875 and 1883, this man robbed 28 stagecoaches in California completely by himself. And the detail nobody can believe: he never fired a single shot. Bart operated like a strategist. He studied the routes, knew the schedules, and knew the stretches where the stagecoach slowed down on the uphill climbs. He would show up on foot, wearing a hat, and with a cloth covering his face, point a shotgun, and give polite orders. He would take the strongbox and disappear on foot into the brush. No horse, no partner, no violence. And the problem was that he wasn't the only one thinking that way. In the 1870s, dozens of outlaws across the West realized the same thing. Stagecoaches were the easiest target there was. No armed escort, no telegraph on the roads to call for help. And even if someone reported the crime, the news took days to reach a sheriff. The chance of getting arrested was almost zero. This became a nightmare for transportation companies and insurance companies. Wells Fargo was losing so much money that it had to come up with a solution. And the answer was simple. They put an armed man with a shotgun on the bench next to the driver. His job was only one thing: protect the cargo. That man became known as the shotgun rider, the guy with the shotgun. And that decision changed armored transport forever. The model Wells Fargo created back then is basically the same one armored trucks still used today, more than 150 years later. And there's one more thing from this story that survived. You know when you get into someone's car and say, "I'm riding shotgun so you can sit in the front seat"? That expression was born right there from that armed man sitting next to the driver, protecting gold in the middle of the desert. Fact 4. Russian roulette on wheels. Deadly accidents. These days we complain about potholes in the road, right? Now imagine traveling hundreds of miles with no pavement, no shock absorbers, no seat belt, inside a wooden box pulled by 6 horses at full speed. That was exactly how passenger transportation worked in the Old West. And the number of people who died that way is something almost nobody talks about. Wells Fargo and Overland Mail Company stagecoaches operated on trails that could barely be called roads. They were packed dirt paths, full of loose rocks, ditches, roots, and dangerous drops. Drivers had to keep a fast pace because their contracts demanded on-time delivery of mail and passengers, so there was no such thing as slowing down just to be safe. The whole point was to run fast. When a wheel blew out or an axle broke on a downhill stretch, the result was devastating. The cabin would tip over, and the passengers would be thrown into each other and onto the rocky ground. Reports from frontier doctors in Wyoming and Colorado during the 1860s and 1870s described compound fractures, cracked skulls, and organs punctured by broken ribs. Panicked horses would drag what was left of the stagecoach for dozens of yards, running over people who were already lying on the ground. And it wasn't just mechanical failure. Sandstorms blinded the horses. Rivers that looked shallow hid strong currents that could flip the whole stagecoach over. In the winter, ice on mountain trails turned every curve into a death sentence. The drivers themselves paid a high price. Life expectancy on the job was absurdly short. Many didn't last 12 months before suffering a serious accident or simply disappearing on a remote route. Companies had constant trouble finding replacements because the job's reputation was already well known. The detail that stands out is that nobody back then thought of passenger safety as a priority. There were no regulations, no vehicle inspections, nothing even close to what we have today. You paid your fare, climbed into that wooden box, and hoped you made it to the other side alive. Fact 5. The military-style operation behind every stagecoach trip. Have you ever stopped to think about what it took to make a stagecoach cross hundreds of miles of hostile territory without stopping? It wasn't just putting horses up front and a driver on the bench. It was an operation with the complexity of a military campaign, and any mistake could cost lives. The problem started with the horses. A team of 4 or 6 animals pulling a loaded stagecoach could handle about 12 miles at most before needing to be swapped out. Do the math. A 100-mile route required at least 7 or 8 relay stops, with fresh teams waiting at each one. We're talking about 40 to 50 horses positioned along a single stretch. And each animal needed water, hay, and someone taking care of it 24 hours a day. Now put those stations in the middle of the Arizona desert or on the dry plains of Nevada, where absolutely nothing grew. Every blade of grass, every grain of oats, every drop of water had to be hauled in by supply wagons that sometimes traveled for days to get there. Stagecoach companies spent more money keeping those stations running than on anything else in the business. And even then, horses died from exhaustion and dehydration at a rate that today would be considered scandalous. The men who worked at those relay stations had one of the loneliest lives in the West. Many stayed alone for weeks, sleeping in adobe shacks in the middle of nowhere, waiting for the next coach to appear in the dust on the horizon. If a station failed, if the horses weren't ready, or the water had run out, the passengers were stranded in territory where the sun could kill just as fast as any outlaw. What's interesting is that this network of stopping points created the country's first hub-style logistics system. Each station was a link in a chain that had to work in perfect sync. If that reminds you of something, it should. The system American Airlines use today, with connections and hubs spread across the country, comes directly from that logic, born in the dust of the 19th century. Fact 6. The diseases that hitched a ride. Have you ever stopped to think about how an epidemic reached some tiny town lost in the middle of the desert, where nobody from the outside showed up for months? The answer was parked right in front of the saloon. The stagecoach didn't just carry people and mail, it carried something nobody could see, and it killed more people than any famous outlaw of the time. The mechanism was brutal in its simplicity. A guy in St. Louis started feeling sick on a Monday. On Tuesday, he thought it was just a cold and bought his ticket. During 2 weeks of travel, he coughed, sweated, and breathed the same air as 8 or 10 other passengers inside a cabin the size of a closet. The windows stayed shut because of the dust and the cold. When the stagecoach stopped to change horses or spend the night, that traveler got out, drank water from the same well, ate at the same counter, and shook the station owner's hand. 2 weeks after he passed through a community, people started getting sick. Cholera, smallpox, and the flu traveled without paying a fare. There was no screening of any kind. If you had the money, you got on. Nobody asked if you were sick. Nobody took your temperature. Indigenous communities and small Mexican villages along the routes were devastated by diseases they had no natural defense against. A single stagecoach passing through a village could wipe out half the population in a matter of weeks. When historians mapped the routes of the main stagecoach lines and compared them with records of epidemic outbreaks in the West between 1850 and 1880, the result was shocking. The outbreaks followed the roads almost as if someone had drawn the route on a map. Every new route opened meant a new trail for disease to travel. Progress and plague walked side by side, literally on the same dirt road. That pattern would repeat decades later, with commercial aviation routes spreading diseases around the entire world. The technology changes, but the problem stays the same. Fact 7. Stagecoach spine, the invisible damage. Have you ever hit a pothole in the road and said, "Damn, that hurt"? Now, multiply that by 12 hours straight, day after day, week after week. The stagecoaches that crossed the American West in the 19th century had nothing like the suspension system we know today. What existed between the cabin and the axles were stretched leather straps called thoroughbraces. In theory, they were supposed to soften the impact. In practice, every rock, every root, every hole in the road sent a blow straight up through the wooden seat and into the base of the passenger's spine. And the roads in the West weren't real roads. They were packed dirt trails, full of ruts, loose rocks, and stretches that looked like they had been forced open because they had been. Doctors at the time started noticing a troubling pattern among frequent passengers and stagecoach drivers. They developed chronic back pain, loss of mobility, and problems that usually showed up in people much older. The term that appeared in medical literature was stagecoach spine. Men in their early 30s were showing up with compressed, worn-down spinal discs as if they were twice their age. And it wasn't just the spine that suffered. The repeated micro-impacts shook the entire body. Organs like the kidneys and liver shifted tiny fractions of an inch with every jolt. With thousands of jolts per trip, the accumulated effect was brutal. And there's one detail modern science helped us understand better. That constant rattling also affected the brain. The mechanism is the same one we now associate with football players. Repeated low-level impacts that on their own seem harmless, but over time cause real damage to brain tissue. Stagecoach passengers were exposed to that for hours on end, sitting on a hard bench, with no seatbelt, no protection, nothing. The scientific concept of cumulative vibration damage was only formally studied in the 20th century, when engineers and doctors began analyzing the effects of industrial machines on the human body. But the passengers and drivers of the Old West were already paying that price 150 years earlier, with no idea what was happening inside them. That wasn't transportation. It was a slow, non-stop beating that nobody could see, but that the body recorded with every mile. Fact 8. The station food that could kill you. You stop at a stagecoach station after hours of getting rattled around on that dirt road. You're hungry, thirsty, covered in dust. Then you look at the plate they put in front of you and think, is this gonna feed me or take me down? That was a real question for anyone traveling through the American West. The stopping stations along the routes were isolated, with no access to markets, no regular suppliers, and most importantly, no kind of refrigeration. The food that got there had to last, and it did, way longer than it should have. Salt pork sat stored for weeks in barrels. With the heat of the desert or the plains, that meat darkened, picked up a strong smell, and developed a greasy layer on top that cooks simply scraped off before throwing it into the skillet. The bread often already showed greenish spots of mold. The coffee was made with water drawn from wells nobody tested, and that were often contaminated with animal waste or decomposing organic matter. The problem wasn't just the bad taste. Bacteria like Salmonella and Clostridium multiplied in those conditions, without anyone knowing what they were or how to fight them. Antibiotics didn't exist. If your body couldn't handle it on its own, you were in serious trouble in the middle of nowhere, days away from any doctor. Many travelers reported arriving at their destination thinner than when they left. Not because they were starving, but because their gut simply rejected almost everything they ate. Vomiting, cramps, severe diarrhea. Dysentery was so common on stagecoach routes that it killed more people in the Old West than armed confrontations. That's not an exaggeration. Records show that intestinal diseases were among the leading causes of death on the frontier. And here's a detail that makes you think. People who grew up back then had digestive systems that were literally tougher than ours. From childhood, their bodies were exposed to food that today any health inspector would throw in the trash without thinking twice. It was an adaptation forced by necessity. Anyone who survived childhood reached adulthood with a tolerance we simply don't have anymore. Food safety regulations for public transportation in the United States only started taking shape in the 20th century. Throughout the entire stagecoach era, what you ate on the road was a matter of luck. And luck in the Old West wasn't always on your side. Number 9, imagine going 25 days without being able to sleep properly. We're not talking about bad nights in your own bed. We're talking about 2,000 miles inside a wooden box, shaking non-stop, day and night, from Missouri to California. That was the reality for anyone who needed to cross the country before the Transcontinental Railroad. The stagecoach didn't stop when it got dark. The driver changed horses at the relay stations and kept going. Inside the cabin, passengers tried to doze off while sitting on hard benches, packed shoulder to shoulder with strangers. Every hole in the dirt road threw everyone up into the air. Every turn shoved their bodies to the side. The most anyone could manage was a few minutes of light sleep before the next jolt woke everybody up again. What happens to the human body under those conditions is something modern medicine knows very well. After 3 or 4 days without proper sleep, the brain starts working differently. A person loses the ability to think clearly. Small decisions become hard. Their mood changes for no reason. After a week, things get worse. The mind starts creating things that aren't there. Shadows in the desert turn into human figures. Sounds from the wind seem like voices. It's not madness. It's the brain trying to function. Without the rest it needs to stay stable. Reports from passengers who completed that route describe exactly those symptoms. People who boarded perfectly healthy arrived at their destination disoriented, irritated, and swearing they had seen strange things along the way. Some took days to recover after getting off. Here's a fact that puts everything into perspective. Sleep deprivation is recognized as a method of torture. International organizations classify the practice of preventing someone from sleeping as inhumane treatment. And yet, thousands of Americans in the 19th century went through it voluntarily. They paid for the privilege. A ticket for that route cost around $200 at the time, the equivalent of several months' wages for an ordinary worker. People paid a fortune to go through something that today would be considered torture, simply because there was no faster alternative to reach California by land. Fact 10. Segregation on 4 wheels. You've probably heard of Jim Crow laws, the ones that separated black people and white people on buses, trains, and in restaurants across the South. But the truth is, that kind of division started long before that, decades before. And it happened on top of a stagecoach, in the middle of the desert, on a packed dirt road. Inside the cabin, in the covered and protected space, traveled the passengers who could pay the full fare. Businessmen, farm owners, families with some money in their pockets. Inside, there was a cushioned bench, shade, and at least a chance of not swallowing so much dust. Now, anyone who couldn't afford the full price rode on the roof. That's right, sitting up there with the trunks, boxes, and mail, poor workers, newly arrived immigrants, people society at the time treated like second-class citizens. They paid less but suffered more. Sun in their face, rain, cutting wind, and the very real risk of falling off along the way. But some people couldn't even get that spot on the roof. Chinese workers, the same ones who broke rock and laid track to build the railroads that changed the country, were often barred. Native Americans, too. You could have money in your hand. You could be willing to pay full fare. It didn't matter. Some stagecoach companies had written rules banning certain groups from boarding. Others didn't put anything on paper, but left it up to the driver, who decided right there on the spot who got on and who stayed behind, waiting for the next trip, with no guarantee that the next one would be any different. The stagecoach worked like a mirror of that society. The place you occupied in it said exactly what America thought of you. And the most important thing to understand here is that this wasn't the exception. It was the pattern. Public transportation as a tool of social separation didn't begin with Jim Crow laws in the 1870s and 1880s. It was already rolling along the roads of the West long before that. The famous open road, the one that promised freedom and opportunity to anyone brave enough to keep moving forward, in practice, wasn't open to everyone. It depended on your color, your origin, and how much respect society thought you deserved. That pattern of using transportation to decide who belongs and who doesn't is something that repeated throughout American history and in different forms is still present today. Fact 11. The Female Survival Code on Stagecoaches. When you think of Old West stagecoaches, you probably picture robberies and shootouts. But there was another danger almost nobody mentions, and it happened inside the cabin itself. Women who had to travel alone faced a situation most men didn't even notice. A stagecoach cabin was a tiny space where 6 to 9 people were pressed up against each other for entire days. No frequent stops, no easy escape, no kind of authority on board. For a woman traveling without a male companion, every stretch of the road was a dangerous unknown, and that's exactly why something emerged that historians rarely documented. A real informal protection system that women created among themselves and on their own. Hat pins, those long pins used to hold hats in place, were about 8 inches long and had a sharp point capable of causing serious injuries. They weren't decoration. They were the first line of defense. Some women went further and hid small Derringer pistols inside the layers of their clothing, where nobody could see them. But the most common tactic didn't involve any weapon. It was pure strategy. Women would team up with other female passengers and pretend they were relatives. They made up fictional husbands waiting at the next stop. Some even acted erratically to keep any unwanted approach away. It worked better than any revolver. Stagecoach drivers themselves recognized the problem. There was an unofficial practice among experienced drivers of seating unaccompanied women on the bench closest to the door. The logic was simple. If the situation inside the cabin became unbearable, she could get out first. This invisible survival system was never recorded in manuals from the time. It was passed from woman to woman, from mother to daughter, from traveler to traveler. And the most striking thing is that many of those same strategies are still used by women on public transportation today. More than 150 years later, the instinct for protection and the improvised methods remain almost exactly the same. Fact 12. Before railroads cut across the continent from coast to coast, stagecoaches were the only regular means of transportation crossing territories the government could barely even map. The trip between Missouri and California could take 3 weeks, crossing hundreds of miles of open plains where there was absolutely nothing between you and the horizon. No trees, no rock formations, no kind of cover. Just short grass as far as the eye could see. And that was exactly the kind of terrain the Comanche dominated like no one else. The Comanche were considered the best combat horsemen the continent had ever produced. That's not an exaggeration. The U.S. Army itself acknowledged it in official reports. They learned to ride before they learned to walk properly, and they developed a technique of hanging off the side of a horse at full gallop, using the animal's body as a shield while firing arrows from under its neck. Try hitting a target like that moving at 30 miles per hour. Now think about the math that just didn't add up. A passenger armed with a single-shot rifle took between 20 and 30 seconds to reload after each shot. In that same amount of time, a Comanche warrior could fire 10 to 12 arrows with deadly accuracy. They attacked in groups, circling the stagecoach, coming from different directions at the same time. The driver couldn't stop because the moving horses were the only chance of survival. But he also couldn't really swerve because the stagecoach had to stay on the marked trail. Passengers tried to aim through windows that barely fit a shoulder. It was like trying to defend yourself from inside a shoebox in the middle of a football field. Stagecoach companies knew certain routes were basically death sentences. After repeated attacks along specific stretches of Texas and New Mexico, entire lines were canceled or rerouted hundreds of miles to avoid Comanche territory. The cost in lives and equipment simply wasn't worth it. Military escorts were often requested, but the Army was spread too thin across the territory and couldn't always protect every convoy. What makes all of this even more relevant is that this kind of tactical disadvantage didn't stay in the 19th century. Military academies still study the principle of ambush in open terrain today, using exactly this kind of scenario as a reference. When you have no cover, no fire superiority, and no control over the distance of the engagement, the side that chooses when and where to attack almost always wins. Fact 13. The cold that killed. Crossing the Rockies at 40°C. Have you ever complained about your car taking too long to warm up on a January morning? Fair enough. Now try to imagine crossing the Rocky Mountains in the middle of winter at 40 below, inside a wooden box full of cracks with no heating of any kind. Not even a lousy warm air ventilation system. Nothing. The stagecoaches that crossed high-altitude stretches in the winter were basically reverse heat traps. The windows were covered with leather panels that didn't seal properly. The mountain wind came through every crack in the structure and kept circulating inside the cabin non-stop. Wool blankets were handed out to passengers, but they made little real difference. And here's a fact that explains everything. The human body loses heat 25 times faster when exposed to wind than in still air. Inside that cabin, the wind never stopped. Passengers sat for hours on end, squeezed up against each other, barely able to move enough to generate their own body heat. The space was too cramped for any kind of exercise. Their feet were the first to lose feeling. Then came the fingers, ears, and nose. Many people reached the next stop with visible signs of frostbite on their limbs. Some lost fingers, others never made it anywhere. Hypothermia was a silent killer on those crossings. It hit the most vulnerable first, the elderly and children, but it spared no one. The process was sneaky because the person would get sleepy, confused, and by the time someone noticed, it was already too late. Freezing to death inside a stagecoach was so common on mountain routes that the transportation companies themselves didn't offer refunds to the victims' families. The risk was built into the contract. By buying the ticket, The passenger accepted that they might not survive the trip. It was that or stay home. And for a lot of people, staying home simply wasn't an option. Fact 14. There's something very few people stop to think about when they picture those stagecoach trips through the Old West. Everyone remembers the outlaws, the Indians, the lawless roads, but there was an enemy that made no noise at all and killed just the same: the heat. The routes that crossed the Mojave Desert were some of the most feared in the country. And the reason wasn't just the lack of water. The stagecoach itself turned into a trap. The whole structure was made of wood, with leather seats and curtains. During the day, with the sun beating down non-stop, the wood absorbed that brutal heat, hour after hour. The leather didn't help at all, quite the opposite. It acted like a kind of insulation that trapped the hot air inside. There was no ventilation. The windows were small and the curtains stayed closed to try to block the dust and the sun. But that turned the interior into a completely sealed space. The temperature outside was already easily over 120 degrees. Inside that box, it was worse. The human body tries to cool itself through sweat. Everyone knows that. But when the air around you is still and saturated with heat, the sweat simply doesn't evaporate. And if the sweat doesn't evaporate, the body's temperature keeps rising. It's a process doctors call hyperthermia. After 2 hours in those conditions, passengers started passing out. Some never woke up again. They died right there, before reaching the next horse-changing station. Travelers who already knew those routes learned one simple rule the hard way: never travel through the Mojave during the day. The crossings were done at night, when the temperature dropped enough to make the whole thing bearable. Anyone who ignored that advice paid dearly. And here's something that connects directly to the present. That same physical principle, an enclosed space that builds up heat and doesn't allow ventilation, is exactly what happens today when a child is locked inside a car parked in the sun. In the United States, hundreds of children still die this way every year. The physics hasn't changed. What was a wooden stagecoach in the 19th century became a car with the windows closed in the 21st century. The mechanism that kills is the same. Fact 15. Imagine this. You ship your trunk on a Wells Fargo stagecoach with everything valuable you own: clothes, tools, maybe months of savings wrapped in a cloth. The stagecoach leaves, and your trunk simply never arrives. What do? The short answer is almost nothing. Wells Fargo's baggage tracking system was basically a piece of paper. The driver carried a handwritten manifest with him, and a lot of the time the description was something like 3 trunks, 2 leather sacks, no owner's name, no identification number, no kind of receipt you could use later to prove it was yours. It was the kind of tracking system we wouldn't accept today, even for a pizza delivery. Now think about what happened when the stagecoach flipped on a mountain curve or got robbed along the way. Wells Fargo had a method that can only be described as improvised. Agents spread out along the route, kept an eye out for whatever showed up dumped on the road. Mule drivers, farmers, anyone who passed through the area ended up becoming a kind of unofficial informant. If someone found a busted open suitcase on the side of the road, they reported it to the nearest station. That was it. That was the system. And compensation. It worked on trust. You said what you had lost, and the company decided whether it believed you or not. Your word against theirs. And since Wells Fargo was the company, and you were just a passenger with no proof at all, you can guess who won that argument. Plenty of people simply never saw a penny back for what they lost. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Internal company records that have survived to this day show a pattern any modern investigator would recognize right away. Certain specific routes had loss rates far above average, and the same drivers showed up repeatedly, tied to those disappearances. The conclusion is hard to avoid. Some of those losses weren't accidents or the work of outlaws. It was inside theft, carried out by the company's own employees. That means the problem of cargo theft inside transportation companies, the kind we still see in headlines today, already existed more than 150 years ago. Wells Fargo was dealing with the same kind of corporate corruption that still haunts logistics operations in the 21st century. Only the tools changed. The human problem stayed exactly the same. Fact 16. Alcoholic drivers. The cruel whiskey cycle. Driving a stagecoach across American territory in the 19th century was one of the most brutal jobs there was. The men who took that job knew exactly what they were getting into. Roads that barely deserved the name, often just dirt trails cutting through canyons and narrow passes where one miscalculation meant plunging hundreds of feet. Robberies were so frequent that the question wasn't if you would be ambushed, but when. And the weather conditions ranged from suffocating heat in the deserts to biting cold in the mountains, all of it during journeys that lasted for days straight without proper rest. In that setting, whiskey became a key part of the routine. We're not talking about fun or celebration. We're talking about men who drank so they could climb back onto that bench one more time. Alcohol worked like anesthesia against fear, against the pain in their backs, wrecked by the constant jolts, and against the exhaustion of staying alert for endless hours. Many drivers carried bottles along with the trip provisions, taking swigs along the way to keep their nerves under control. The result was predictable. Drunk men trying to control teams of 4 or 6 horses on treacherous terrain. Accidents happened with terrifying regularity. Stagecoaches tipped over on curves. Horses got out of control when the driver reacted too late. Passengers were injured or died in falls off cliffs. The companies that ran these routes were fully aware of the problem, but there was a real dilemma. Almost nobody agreed to do that job completely sober. Turnover among drivers was extremely high, and finding replacements willing to face that reality was already hard enough without demanding sobriety. So the companies simply ignored the issue. As long as the driver managed to complete the route and deliver passengers and mail, nobody asked how many bottles he had emptied along the way. It was a silent agreement where everyone lost, except the company owners who kept making money. This pattern of functional alcoholism as a direct result of extreme work didn't stay trapped in the past. High-risk professions still have high rates of substance dependence today, showing that when the system pushes people beyond their limits, they find their own ways to cope, even if those ways end up destroying the people who use them. Fact 17. $200 for a ticket, a year's salary, $200. That was the price of a stagecoach ticket from Missouri to California around 1850. Today it sounds like pocket change, but back then, $200 was what an ordinary worker earned in an entire year of hard labor. 1 year. Think about that for a second. The gold rush turned transportation in the West into one of the most profitable businesses in the country. A few companies controlled the available routes, and since there was no real competition, they charged whatever they wanted. With thousands of people desperate to get to California, demand was insane, and prices rose along with it. Inflation in that region got completely out of control. An egg could cost the equivalent of $1 in certain mining towns. A simple shovel could be worth more than a week of work. But what would make a man pay everything he had for a ticket? Eastern newspapers. The headlines sold an irresistible story, gold everywhere, nuggets the size of fists, fortunes made in weeks. What the newspapers didn't say was that most prospectors came back empty-handed, if they came back at all. The hype was so strong that entire families sold farms, cattle, tools, everything they owned, to fund a trip with no guarantee of return. Many took out loans they were never able to pay back. Some died along the way, from disease, hunger, or violence. And the debt didn't die with them. It passed on to their children, who inherited not land or wealth, but financial obligations left behind by a dream that never came true. The scheme was simple. The media created the fever. Transportation companies profited from the movement. Merchants in mining towns charged fortunes for basic items. And the guy who left everything behind to look for gold ended up taking the loss. The house always won. If that sounds familiar, it's because the model hasn't changed all that much. Financial bubbles, miracle investment schemes, promises of getting rich quick. The mechanics are the same. The packaging changes, but the product stays the same. Someone sells the dream, and someone pays the bill. Fact 18. Wolves and bears that hunted stagecoaches. This is going to make you rethink everything you know about predators. In the Old West, wolves and bears stopped hunting the way they always had and started targeting the stagecoaches crossing the plains. Not by accident. These animals learned to associate specific sounds and smells with guaranteed food. The process was gradual. When a stagecoach stopped at night at a makeshift camp, the horses were tied up, too exhausted after hours of pulling heavy loads over dirt roads. The passengers lit fires and cooked. The smell of food spread for miles through the clean prairie air. Wolves and grizzlies that lived in those regions started to notice a pattern. Where there was the sound of wooden wheels hitting rocks and the strong smell of sweaty horses, there was a meal waiting. The brains of these predators work through direct association. It only took a few successful attacks on camps for the behavior to stick. Stagecoaches carried dried meat, flour, and all kinds of provisions. Exhausted horses didn't have the energy to bolt, and the armed escort was rarely more than 2 guys, which didn't mean much against an organized pack or an adult grizzly that could weigh more than 770 pounds and run almost 35 miles per hour. Wolves in particular developed something like a military strategy. Part of the pack would approach from one side, drawing the attention of the guards and the horses. While the men reacted to the first group, other wolves moved in from the opposite side, going straight for the provisions or the pack animals. Transportation company records from the time mentioned constant losses on certain routes, and stagecoach drivers reported that the attacks didn't seem random. The animals knew where to wait and when to act. This kind of behavioral adaptation is now a well-established field of study in biology. Scientists who work with wildlife management recognize that large predators adjust their hunting strategies when humans create predictable patterns in the environment. The commercial routes of the West worked like a food delivery system, and predators made a point of exploiting it with an efficiency that still surprises modern researchers. Fact 19. Before airplanes, before interstate highways, before anything we know today, there was one way to cross the American West with some chance of making it out alive. And that way had a name. You know very well. Wells Fargo wasn't just a bank. In the second half of the 19th century, it practically owned transportation between the Mississippi and the Pacific. Stagecoaches, mail routes, gold shipments, packages, everything passed through its hands. And when a company controls the only road there is, it charges whatever it wants. That was exactly what happened. Posters spread across eastern towns promised organized, safe trips with set schedules. Entire families sold everything they had and bought tickets trusting those promises. But once the stagecoach left, the story changed. Routes were stretched out with no explanation. Stops that weren't in the original plan showed up along the way, and every stop meant more expenses for the passenger, whether for food, lodging, or a new fee. There was no alternative. The road belonged to Wells Fargo. The vehicle belonged to Wells Fargo. The driver belonged to Wells Fargo. If you complained, the most you got was an indifferent look. Real competition simply didn't exist. Smaller companies that tried to operate on the same routes were bought out or pushed out of the market. Wells Fargo negotiated exclusive contracts with the federal government to carry mail, which gave it a level of power no competitor could stand up to. It was a monopoly, built with strategy, political influence, and total control of the infrastructure. The most interesting part is that the company's public image was completely different from the reality. The ads showed a reliable operation, almost patriotic, bringing progress to the West. Nobody talked about the inflated fares, the manipulated routes, or the behind-the-scenes deals. This pattern of one company dominating an entire industry and controlling what the public knows about it didn't stay in the 19th century. It repeated itself with railroads, with oil, with telecommunications. The packaging changes, but the mechanism is the same. When there's no real choice, the customer is always the one who pays the bill. Fact 20. Before World War I, before doctors came up with terms like shell shock or combat neurosis, there were already people broken on the inside in the United States, and they weren't soldiers. They were ordinary civilians who crossed the American plains in stagecoaches and covered wagons during the 19th century. What they saw and lived through on those crossings left scars that the medicine of the time simply didn't know how to explain. Frontier doctors wrote in their records about patients who arrived at their stations with a completely empty stare. They couldn't sleep. They jumped at any noise. Some stopped speaking for weeks. Others had violent outbursts for no apparent reason. People started calling it prairie madness. That term appears in diaries, letters, and medical documents scattered across the Midwest. The triggers were real and brutal. Men who witnessed attacks on wagon trains, who saw companions die in violent ways, who buried entire families in the middle of nowhere, carried those images for the rest of their lives. That distant look that decades later would be called the 1,000-yard stare in the trenches of France already existed on the faces of American settlers long before that. The difference is that nobody studied the phenomenon. There was no battlefield psychiatry, no formal diagnosis, no treatment. Many of these men went back east and simply couldn't readjust to normal life. They drank too much, isolated themselves, and had constant nightmares. Their families didn't understand what had happened. Society expected them to be tough and move on. Hollywood turned that reality into a romantic adventure full of fearless heroes, but the documents from the time tell a completely different story. The vast majority of those people never spoke publicly about what they had lived through. They died carrying memories nobody wanted to hear. Official recognition of psychological trauma as a legitimate medical condition only came in the 20th century, when the same symptoms appeared on a massive scale after the Great Wars. But the suffering was already there, decades earlier, hidden on the American plains.